Cape Canaveral, Florida. The morning air smells of salt and kerosene. Waves crash softly against the Atlantic shore as the sun rises over a line of gleaming silver rockets. It is 1952, and a new chapter in human flight is about to begin. American officers in white caps stand beside engineers in dusty lab coats, their eyes fixed on a towering missile marked with the insignia of the United States Army. Cameras click. A countdown begins. But among the crowd, a few men stand silently apart, their accents unmistakably German, their gazes distant. For them, this scene is déjà vu. The rocket's sleek body, its fuel lines, even the curvature of its fins, all look hauntingly familiar. These men once built its ancestor in the darkness of a war-torn Europe. Once, this shape had carried death to London. Now, under a new flag, it is reborn as the promise of progress. As the engines ignite and the rocket lifts into the sky, the ground trembles, and in that thunder, history whispers a chilling truth. The blueprints of Peenemünde have returned, rising again from the ashes of defeat, reborn on the sands of Cape Canaveral, in the final winters of the Second World War, deep in the pine forests of northern Germany. A place existed that few outside the Reich had ever heard of: Peenemünde. On paper, it was an army research center. In truth, it was the birthplace of the world's first ballistic missile. Here, under the cold glare of arc lamps and the strict eye of the SS, German scientists worked to build a weapon that could cross the edge of the sky and strike a city hundreds of miles away. The V-2 rocket, short for Vergeltungswaffe 2, Retribution Weapon 2, was Adolf Hitler's attempt to turn science into vengeance. While Allied bombers destroyed factories and cities, the Nazi leadership demanded a miracle that would reverse their fate. That miracle was the rocket. The program's brilliant yet conflicted architect was Wernher von Braun, a young engineer whose dreams of space exploration had been consumed by the machinery of war. Around him, thousands of laborers, many prisoners from concentration camps, were forced to assemble rocket parts under inhuman conditions. Each new prototype meant more suffering, yet the regime pressed forward. On test days, the roar of engines rolled over the Baltic coast like distant thunder. The rockets streaked upward in fiery arcs, vanishing into clouds, leaving behind only the smell of burned alcohol and metal. By 1943, Peenemünde had become one of the Reich's most guarded secrets. The British intelligence network began intercepting fragments of reports about a long-range rocket. In August 1943, Operation Hydra struck. Royal Air Force bombers thundered across the night sky and dropped hundreds of tons of explosives over the island base. The bombardment was devastating, laboratories shattered, engineers killed, and the myth of the invulnerable fortress destroyed. Yet the project survived. Within weeks, production was moved underground to the Mittelwerk tunnels near Nordhausen, where prisoners from Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp built the rockets in pitch-black caverns carved from stone. The V-2 was unlike any weapon the world had seen. When launched, it climbed nearly 60 miles above Earth's surface, then plunged faster than the speed of sound. There was no warning, no defense. The first operational launch came in September 1944. A streak of fire rose from the Dutch coast. Minutes later, an explosion ripped through the heart of London, killing civilians who never heard it coming. Over the next months, thousands of V-2s rained upon London, Antwerp, and Liège. Each impact left a crater 20 meters wide. The rockets failed to change the outcome of the war, but their psychological power was immense. They announced a new era, one in which death could fall from the edge of space. As the Allies advanced through Germany in 1945, Peenemünde scientists faced a grim choice. They could surrender to the Soviets or to the Americans, and both sides were closing in. Von Braun's team fled south, carrying whatever documents and prototypes they could save. Behind them, SS guards destroyed files and blew up test stands. The dream of the V-2 was collapsing, but its legacy had already escaped the ruins. In the tunnels, Allied investigators later uncovered rows of unfinished rockets and the corpses of slave laborers who had perished building them. The contrast was unbearable. Technological genius born from human misery. When the German surrender finally came in May 1945, the race for the future began. The Allies were no longer fighting for territory. They were fighting for knowledge. American, British, and Soviet teams combed the wreckage of the Reich, searching for blueprints, engines, and scientists. They found crates of documents labeled A4, the V2's internal designation. In dusty filing cabinets lay the seeds of the jet age, the missile age, and the space age. To many in Washington and Moscow, the war had simply shifted from trenches to laboratories. Whoever controlled this technology would control the skies of tomorrow. It was within this chaos that the story's moral complexity began to unfold. The men who had served a brutal regime now possessed the keys to a new world. Their inventions had killed thousands, yet their knowledge could save millions. Governments faced an impossible dilemma: condemn them as war criminals or recruit them as scientists. As the smoke of Europe's battlefields lifted, a quiet new conflict began, one fought not with tanks, but with test stands and slide rules. And so, from the ashes of Peenemünde, a new front opened, one that stretched from the ruins of Nordhausen to the deserts of New Mexico. In the summer of 1945, as Germany lay in ruins, a silent race began between the Allies. This race was not for cities or soldiers, it was for minds. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood that the technologies born inside Hitler's laboratories could determine the balance of power for decades. The V-2 rocket had proven that reaching the edge of space was no longer science fiction. It was engineering reality. Whoever controlled those blueprints could control the next century. In May, American intelligence officers launched a secret operation called Project Overcast, soon renamed Operation Paperclip. Under its shadow, U.S. military teams scoured German villages, interrogating engineers, and seizing documents before Soviet forces could arrive. The moral lines blurred quickly. Many of the scientists they sought were card-carrying members of the Nazi Party, some even SS officers. But Washington was no longer thinking in moral absolutes. The Cold War had already begun, even before the last gun fell silent. The fear was clear. If these men fell into Soviet hands, the Kremlin would soon command rockets capable of striking any American city. By the end of 1945, the U.S. Army had quietly gathered more than 100 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, including Wernher von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and Kurt D. Buss. They were transported first to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Officially, they were technical advisors. In reality, they were prisoners of knowledge, rebuilding their old research under new flags. Von Braun himself, once a colonel in the SS, now wore an American uniform, carrying the same notebooks he had used at Peenemünde. In those pages were the foundations for the next generation of missiles, and eventually, the rockets that would reach the moon. Meanwhile, across Europe, the Soviets were conducting their own raids. Red Army units captured parts of the Peenemünde team that hadn't escaped in time. These scientists were shipped east to work under Sergei Korolev, the Soviet Union's chief rocket designer. The Soviets dismantled entire German facilities and transported them to sites near Moscow. Within months, both sides of the Iron Curtain were secretly reconstructing the same weapon, line for line, bolt for bolt. The Cold War was beginning not in Berlin or Washington, but in the laboratories where German designs were reborn. Back in the United States, the political climate grew complicated. The public knew little of these transfers. The files of Operation Paperclip were classified. Officials downplayed or erased the Nazi affiliations of their new experts. Some records were rewritten entirely, transforming SS engineers into civilian specialists. The justification was always the same: survival in a dangerous new world. America needed their knowledge, and morality, for the moment, could wait. At White Sands, tests began almost immediately. Using salvaged V-2 parts shipped from Europe, the U.S. Army launched dozens of rockets into the high desert sky. Each launch was a spectacle, a column of fire rising from the sands of New Mexico, echoing the distant roars once heard over the Baltic. For many of the German engineers, the sound was both familiar and haunting. They were building again what they had once destroyed. Von Braun often spoke of the V-2 as a step towards space exploration. But in the eyes of those who had seen London burn, the memory could not be separated from its victims. Yet the progress was undeniable. The American military quickly realized that these rockets could be more than scientific experiments. They could be weapons of unmatched reach. The Redstone and Jupiter programs that followed were direct descendants of the V-2. As engineers refined guidance systems and improved fuel mixtures, they pushed the limits of altitude, range, and precision. The missiles that would one day carry nuclear warheads began as sketches drawn in the bunkers of Peenemünde. By the late 1940s, rumors began to circulate within the American scientific community. Some young engineers at the newly formed Jet Propulsion Laboratory noticed that the blueprints they were studying bore markings in German. Others recognized specific design signatures, fuel pump configurations, gyroscopic layouts, identical to those once seen in captured Nazi documents. When whispers spread that the Cape Canaveral prototypes looked eerily like V-2s, officials dismissed them as coincidence. But in private, senior officers knew the truth. The foundation of America's missile and space programs had been laid not in Texas or Florida, but in the shadow of the Third Reich. By the early 1950s, the paper trail had been buried under layers of secrecy. The world saw only the rising American arsenal, not the ghosts within it. To the public, Cape Canaveral symbolized innovation. To those who recognized the contours of the rockets standing there, it represented something more complex, a resurrection. The blueprints of Peenemünde had survived the war, crossed the ocean, and found a new home under a different flag. The Second World War had ended, but its most powerful weapon, knowledge, was only beginning its journey. And soon, it would light up the skies again, not as a bomb, but as a beacon of ambition. The story of Peenemunde's rebirth at Cape Canaveral can be seen from many perspectives: scientific triumph, moral compromise, and strategic necessity. To understand it, we must look beyond the launch pads and blueprints into the minds and motives of those who built this bridge from war to space. The first and perhaps most striking angle is technological. When the V-2 rockets first flew in 1944, they represented the absolute frontier of physics and engineering. No one had ever built a liquid-fueled engine capable of reaching the edge of space. The Germans had mastered combustion stability, turbopump synchronization, and aerodynamic control long before any other nation. To Allied scientists examining capture components in 1945, the discovery was both astonishing and humbling. The V-2's engine design alone contained innovations that would take years to replicate. It was a weapon ahead of its time, so advanced that it seemed alien. When American engineers began adapting these designs at White Sands, they realized they were standing on the shoulders of enemies. Step by step, the V-2 became the blueprint for the Redstone and Jupiter missiles, each iteration extending the limits of flight. What had once been a terror weapon was now the seed of intercontinental travel. The second angle is human, and it is perhaps the most haunting. For the German scientists brought to America, life was a strange paradox. They had escaped the ruins of their homeland, yet they could not escape their past. Many carried the guilt of complicity, of designing weapons used to kill civilians, of working in programs that exploited slave labor. Wernher von Braun was often photographed smiling beside American generals, yet privately, he struggled with his own image. His lifelong dream had been to explore space, not to wage war. But ambition had tied him to a regime that turned his dream into destruction. Under Operation Paperclip, these men were given new homes, new titles, and, for many, new identities. Some embraced their second chance. Others lived in quiet remorse. Every launch at Cape Canaveral was a reminder that genius and guilt could coexist in the same hands. Then came the strategic angle, the one that explains why morality bent under the pressure of politics. In 1946, the world had split into two armed camps. The Soviet Union's advance into Eastern Europe had redrawn the map of power, and the United States could not afford to lag behind in military technology. The rocket was no longer a curiosity, it was a weapon of deterrence. Both superpowers saw in it the ability to deliver not just conventional explosives, but atomic ones. To Washington's military planners, the question was not whether to use the German scientists, but how quickly they could make their knowledge American. The Cold War demanded results, and the moral debates were left to history. The first American rocket capable of carrying a nuclear warhead owed its shape, its structure, and even its guidance principles to the V-2. It was a bitter irony. The very weapon designed to secure Nazi domination was now being used to preserve Western freedom. A fourth and deeply revealing perspective is the institutional one: how secrecy transformed truth. Inside government reports, the scientists of Operation Paperclip were described in sanitized terms: technical experts, aerospace specialists, consultants. Their affiliations with the Nazi Party were scrubbed or downplayed. Files that once bore the stamp of the SS were rewritten with neutral military classifications. Journalists who asked questions were told that America's new rocket projects were entirely domestic in origin. The myth of self-contained American ingenuity was politically necessary. In an age of patriotic optimism and moral reckoning, the public could not easily accept that their space dreams were built on borrowed blueprints from a defeated dictatorship. And so, the true origins of Cape Canaveral's rockets remained buried for decades, hidden behind classified folders marked for national security reasons. But behind these narratives lay another truth, the scientific one, pure and unvarnished. To the men who stood on the test ranges, science was the only loyalty that mattered. In their minds, technology transcended politics. The same physics that sent a warhead across the channel could one day send a capsule to the moon. Von Braun often spoke of his rockets as vehicles of destiny. To him, the V-2 had been only the first step on a longer journey, one that he believed would end not in conquest, but in exploration. His speeches in America were filled with optimism, mankind reaching for the stars, nations uniting in pursuit of knowledge. But his critics never forgot where that journey began, in tunnels lit by torches, among prisoners forced to build his dream. This duality, progress built on pain, became the defining tension of the post-war rocket era. Every test launch at White Sands, every engine ignition at Cape Canaveral carried an echo of the past. The engineers cheered its success, but in the silence that followed, some could almost hear the voices of those who never lived to see this triumph. Science had marched forward, but morality lagged behind. The question that haunted many, and still does, was simple. Can humanity separate invention from its origins? By the dawn of the 1950s, the answer remained uncertain. The rockets were growing taller, faster, more powerful. The skies above Florida were no longer empty. They were streaked with trails of fire. Yet for the men who once worked in Peenemunde's laboratories, those fiery trails carried both pride and penance. They had brought their knowledge across an ocean, but their past had come with them. The technology had survived the war. The conscience of its creators, however, was still on trial. Beyond the human and technological drama, the story of these rockets also unfolded along the lines of science, politics, and rivalry, forces that defined the mid-20th century. At its core lay a paradox. The same machines that had once symbolized tyranny now embodied mankind's reach for the stars. The blueprints were identical, but the narrative had changed from vengeance to vision. The scientific angle reveals how little in the world of innovation truly begins from scratch. When von Braun and his team arrived in America, they carried not only notebooks, but experience, years of trial, error, and data gathered at Peenemünde. Their knowledge became the missing link between wartime experiments and modern spaceflight. American scientists, though highly capable, had never tested a rocket beyond a few dozen miles. The Germans had gone 10 times higher. As research continued at White Sands and later at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, Engineers noticed that every solution they found seemed to echo an older one: fuel mixture ratios, turbopump designs, stabilizing fins. Each discovery had roots buried deep in the past. Out of these refinements emerged the Redstone missile, a direct descendant of the V2. By the early 1950s, it stood as proof that Peenemünde's legacy had not died with the Reich. It had evolved. The scientific community knew it, even if the public did not. The political angle, however, was far less clean. In Washington, the revelation that former Nazis were working for the U.S. Army had the potential to ignite scandal. The Cold War demanded heroes, not moral compromises. As a result, propaganda reshaped reality. Official statements emphasized progress and downplayed origin. Photographs showed smiling scientists beside American officers, flags fluttering in the background. The message was clear. These were no longer Germans. They were pioneers of the free world. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, a mirror image played out. Captured engineers were rebranded as consultants, their contributions quietly absorbed into Soviet rocketry. Both sides rewrote history, erasing the gray zones that lay between guilt and necessity. Truth was the first casualty of the new ideological war. Still, propaganda could not hide the strategic rivalry taking shape. Every successful U.S. test provoked an equal or greater response from Moscow. When American papers hailed the Redstone's launch, Soviet intelligence immediately relayed orders to accelerate its own program. Under the guidance of Sergei Korolev, the Soviets produced the R-1 and later the R-7 Semyorka, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. It was not only capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, it could also launch a satellite. By 1957, the R-7 would send Sputnik 1 into orbit, stunning the world and humiliating Washington. For American officials, it was a moment of reckoning. How could the nation that had taken the best German minds fall behind? The answer lay in bureaucracy, secrecy, and hesitation. While von Braun's team pushed for an ambitious space program, the Pentagon remained focused on military applications. The Germans wanted to reach the moon. The Americans wanted to reach Moscow first. In this tension between exploration and domination lies the moral angle. History often treats technology as neutral, but its use defines its legacy. The rockets that once carried death now promised discovery, yet their creators had never truly escaped the shadow of their past. Survivors of the V-2 bombings in London wrote bitter editorials when news leaked that von Braun was working for NASA. Families of the Mittelbau prisoners called it a betrayal of justice. The U.S. government, eager to defend its scientists, argued that redemption came through progress. They are serving humanity now, one official declared in 1958. But for many, that justification rang hollow. The faces of the dead could not be erased by the light of a launch. Meanwhile, within the engineering community itself, a quieter revolution was unfolding: the institutional angle. The work that began under military supervision gradually expanded into civilian territory. In 1958, the formation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, marked the formal transition from weapon to wonder. Yet, even within NASA, von Braun's team remained dominant. The laboratories at Huntsville were filled with engineers who had once worn Wehrmacht uniforms. Their methods, their terminology, even their drawing conventions carried traces of their past. American recruits often joked that English was the second language of rocket science. What began as a wartime program had, in less than 15 years, become a national space agency. The irony was inescapable. The road to the stars was paved with the remnants of a defeated empire. The Soviet perspective added another layer of complexity. In Moscow, the success of German-inspired technology fueled national pride, but also resentment. Korolev's engineers, though grateful for the captured blueprints, sought to surpass them. The R-7, entirely Soviet in design, was both a technical and ideological triumph, proof that the USSR no longer needed Germany's shadow to guide it. Each launch from Baikonur was more than a scientific test. It was a declaration that communism could conquer space. In this duel of systems, rockets became metaphors for destiny. And then came the philosophical angle, the one history rarely measures but always feels. What does it mean when the same invention can both destroy and inspire? The V-2 had been conceived as a weapon of vengeance. Its descendants carried astronauts beyond the atmosphere. The equation of progress and pain was written into every bolt. For von Braun, this was destiny fulfilled. Technology had redeemed itself. For others, it was merely history repeating, cloaked in new ideals. The rockets rose higher, but the questions stayed on the ground. By the mid-1950s, those questions were drowned out by the roar of engines. The world's superpowers were locked in an arms race that would soon leap beyond Earth itself. On the launch pads of Cape Canaveral and Baikonur, science and ideology fused into one spectacle: fire against sky, fear against hope. The age of rockets had truly begun, and humanity was standing at the threshold of the heavens. But behind the applause and headlines, some still remembered the darkness where it all began, the tunnels, the prisoners, the ashes. The world was looking upward, yet its past still smoldered beneath its feet. By the early 1950s, the winds along Florida's Atlantic coast carried a new kind of thunder, the sound of rockets being born again. Cape Canaveral, once just a stretch of empty shoreline, was transforming into the beating heart of a technological revolution. Military trucks rumbled down sandy roads, carrying crates marked "Ordnance, handle with care." White tents stood beside new concrete bunkers, and palm trees swayed against the distant flashes of fire from test stands. This was Project Hermes, the United States' first attempt to adapt and improve the German V-2 for its own defense. For some, it symbolized progress. For others, it was déjà vu. Standing near one of those launch pads was Wernher von Braun, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The rocket before him, the Hermes A-1, bore an uncanny resemblance to the V-2 he had once supervised under the Nazi regime. The same conical nose, the same tail fins, the same roaring engine fed by alcohol and liquid oxygen. But this time, the insignia painted on its body was not the swastika. It was the star of the United States Army. When the countdown reached 0, a burst of white flame erupted, shaking the ground. The rocket rose slowly at first, then with astonishing speed, disappearing into a column of smoke that trailed high above the Atlantic. Engineers cheered. Officers saluted. Von Braun simply watched, silent. The sound was identical to what he had heard on the Baltic coast years before. History was repeating, only the flags had changed. The early tests were rough. Many rockets exploded mid-air or veered off course, crashing into the marshlands. But failure was only another form of data. Each misfire revealed the next improvement. By 1953, the Redstone missile emerged, longer, heavier, and far more precise. It was the first American ballistic missile capable of delivering a nuclear payload. In the glow of its launch flame, America saw not only military might, but also the promise of reaching beyond Earth. The scientists spoke of payload capacity and thrust-to-weight ratios. But behind the technical language lay something more primal, the desire to conquer the heavens before anyone else could. News of these experiments spread quickly, and not everyone celebrated. Veterans who had fought through the ruins of London were stunned when they saw photos of Cape Canaveral's test rockets. To them, the sleek cylinders looked hauntingly familiar. Newspapers began publishing editorials asking how former Nazi engineers could now be celebrated as American heroes. In Washington, officials scrambled to contain the narrative, emphasizing patriotism and progress. "The past is behind us," one military spokesman declared. "What matters now is what these men can build for the future." But to those who remembered the V-2 bombardments, the sight of its rebirth under the American flag was deeply unsettling. For von Braun's team, however, there was no looking back. Their focus shifted to precision and altitude, the next frontier. At White Sands, test launches pierced higher into the atmosphere, breaking records once thought impossible. The roar of the engines could be heard for miles, echoing across the desert like thunder rolling through history. Scientists recorded every second of flight, measuring trajectory, speed, and combustion efficiency. Each successful test moved them closer to the dream von Braun had always harbored: space travel. To him, every missile was a stepping stone, a necessary evolution from war to exploration. Yet the irony remained inescapable. The rockets that would one day carry astronauts into orbit had begun their lives as instruments of terror. By 1955, von Braun's Redstone team had established itself at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, ABMA, in Huntsville, Alabama. The site became a sanctuary for German and American engineers alike, a strange hybrid of Peenemünde and post-war America. Drawings of new designs covered the walls, coffee cups sat beside scale models, and conversations drifted between English and German. They worked obsessively, sometimes 20 hours straight, driven by equal parts ambition and competition. For they knew what was happening across the Atlantic. Soviet scientists, led by Sergei Korolev, were rapidly advancing their own rocket program. Rumors whispered of incredible successes, of rockets larger, stronger, faster than anything the Americans had built. That realization set the stage for a new kind of warfare, one fought in silence, measured in altitude and speed. Cape Canaveral became the proving ground, and every launch was now a statement to the world. The Americans tested their Jupiter-C rockets, sleek and slender, stretching higher into the heavens. Each ignition illuminated the night sky over Florida, a pillar of flame rising into the darkness like a torch of defiance. The same technology that once rained destruction on Europe was now racing toward the edge of space. The scientists spoke of orbital mechanics, but in the Pentagon, another word was used: dominance. And yet, beneath the triumph, there lingered unease. Some of the older German engineers, men who had once stood in the tunnels of middlework, rarely smiled during launches. They saw in the flames a reflection of their past. One of them, Arthur Rudolph, would later confess that the success of each rocket filled him with both pride and guilt. "We wanted to reach the stars," he said years later, "but we could not escape the ghosts." By the end of 1957, that ghost would become global. From a remote steppe in Kazakhstan, a silver sphere called Sputnik soared into orbit, sending its beeping signal across the world. The Soviet Union had beaten the United States to space. For Washington, it was a humiliation. For von Braun, it was vindication, proof that rocketry, not rhetoric, determined the future. But before the celebration could begin, the reality sank in. The race for space was now a race for survival. The stage was set for a transformation that would shock even those who built it. The night of October 4th, 1957, changed the world forever. Above the plains of Kazakhstan, a small object the size of a beach ball broke free from Earth's gravity and began to orbit the planet. Its name was Sputnik 1. To the Soviet Union, it was a triumph of socialism and science. To the United States, it was a wake-up call that shattered complacency. In living rooms across America, families listened in awe and fear as radios picked up Sputnik's steady beeping signal from space. Each ping was a reminder that the Soviets now possessed rockets powerful enough to reach anywhere on Earth. The same technology that lifted a satellite could just as easily deliver a warhead. The space age had begun, but it was born from dread. In Washington, panic spread like wildfire. Senators demanded answers. Newspapers declared a missile gap. Schoolchildren practiced duck-and-cover drills, while engineers at Cape Canaveral worked around the clock. Amid the chaos stood Wernher von Braun, the man once branded too controversial for public leadership. For years, his team had pleaded with officials to let them attempt a satellite launch, only to be overruled by political caution. Now, after Sputnik, they were finally unleashed. The project was called Explorer 1, and its success would restore America's pride. January 31st, 1958. The Florida night was humid and tense. At Launch Complex 26, the Jupiter-C rocket gleamed beneath floodlights. Von Braun's engineers checked every valve, every wire, every guidance system. A small American flag had been painted near the nose cone, the capsule carrying the satellite that would reclaim the heavens. As the countdown reached 0, the ground shook. Fire and smoke billowed outward. The rocket climbed into the sky, its roar echoing across the Atlantic. Moments later, radar confirmed what millions were praying for. Explorer 1 was in orbit. Cheers erupted at the Cape. Engineers embraced, some shouting, some weeping. Von Braun, composed but emotional, simply whispered, "Now we are part of the universe." Yet beneath the celebration lay the most astonishing irony of all. The very technology that had made Sputnik possible had been born in the same wartime laboratories as America's own. The Cold War rivals were racing to space on parallel tracks, both built on the foundations of Peenemünde. The men who had once been enemies now served opposite empires, their designs hauntingly familiar. Even the Engine's blueprints bore identical lines. The only difference was the flag painted on the side. With the success of Explorer 1 came transformation. The U.S. government, recognizing the need for unified civilian control of space exploration, established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, on July 29, 1958. Overnight, von Braun's military team was absorbed into a new institution dedicated not to warfare, but to discovery. The tone shifted from secrecy to aspiration. The same men who had once designed weapons for the Third Reich were now designing vehicles to carry humanity beyond Earth. It was a reinvention so complete that many Americans never questioned its origins. In press conferences, von Braun spoke not of vengeance or power, but of peace. "Our purpose," he told reporters, "is to expand the frontier of human knowledge." But not everyone was convinced. In Europe, survivors of the V2 attacks watched with unease as von Braun's smiling face appeared on magazine covers. To them, his redemption seemed too effortless, his transformation too convenient. British newspapers published stories detailing his wartime record, his SS membership, his presence at sites where slave laborers had died by the thousands. The moral weight of history could not be erased by the glow of rocket exhaust. Still, in America's Cold War narrative, von Braun had become indispensable, a symbol of victory through science. To question him was to question progress itself. As the 1960s approached, the race to space accelerated beyond imagination. The Soviets launched Yuri Gagarin, the first human in orbit, in April 1961. Just weeks later, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and issued a challenge that would define an era. "Before this decade is out, we shall land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth." Behind those words stood the same team that had once labored under Hitler's command, now working for NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Their mission: design the rocket that could make Kennedy's dream real. That rocket would be called the Saturn V. Towering over the launch pad like a cathedral of steel, it embodied both the triumph and the paradox of modern science. Every bolt, every engine, every stage traced its lineage back to the V2, the child of war that became the parent of exploration. When the first Saturn engines ignited during testing, the ground trembled for miles. Old engineers, their hair now gray, closed their eyes as the thunder rolled. Some smiled, others looked haunted. The sound was familiar, the destination different. In 1969, that journey reached its zenith when Apollo 11 lifted from Cape Kennedy, the same soil where the V2's American descendants had once roared. The world watched as Neil Armstrong's voice echoed through the static. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." It was a moment of universal pride, a triumph of technology, courage, and vision. In the quiet corridors of NASA, a few engineers knew that some of the math used to guide the spacecraft to the moon had been first written in Peenemünde. The ghosts of history had traveled farther than anyone imagined. The rocket that had once symbolized destruction had carried humanity to the stars. But the question lingered: could progress built on pain ever truly be pure? The answer, perhaps, lay not in the machinery, but in the memory. For those who had witnessed both, the fall of London and the rise of the moon. The sight of a rocket lifting through the clouds was forever a mixture of awe and unease. The roar that once heralded war had become the sound of wonder. And yet, in its echo, history still whispered. When the roar of Apollo 11's engines faded into the silence of the moon, the world cheered, but within the corridors of power and history, an unease lingered. The rockets that had lifted mankind into the stars were, at their core, the same designs that once plunged cities into darkness. In the years following 1969, declassified documents began to reveal what journalists and historians had long suspected. The lineage from Hitler's Virgil-Tungswaff II to NASA Saturn V was not coincidence. It was continuity. Internal memos from the Army Ballistic Missile Agency confirmed that Peenemunde's blueprints, translated and adapted, had guided early Redstone calculations. Engineering sketches found in government archives bore German notations in the margins, dates erased, but handwriting unmistakable. The evidence was overwhelming. The foundation of America's space triumph was built upon the bones of war. For Wernher von Braun, the aftermath was both triumph and torment. He stood before television cameras as a national hero, receiving medals from presidents and invitations to universities. Yet outside the glow of spotlights, critics grew louder. Survivors of Dora, Mittelbau published testimonies describing the brutality of the tunnels where the V-2 had been born, forced laborers dying by the thousands as engines were assembled under chains and dust. Newspapers in Europe called it a moral eclipse. In the United States, Congress quietly debated whether celebrating von Braun distorted justice. The answer, as always, was complicated. To most Americans, he symbolized redemption, a man who turned his genius from destruction to discovery. To his detractors, he remained proof that progress can flourish without conscience. Meanwhile, historians traced the broader legacy. From the 1940s to the 1970s, nearly 1,600 German scientists and engineers had entered the U.S. under Operation Paperclip. Some advanced medicine, others aerodynamics or electronics, but the rocket men shaped the future most profoundly. Their work not only powered the space race, but redefined warfare. The same trajectory equations that guided Apollo's lunar modules also governed the intercontinental missiles resting in underground silos. Each carried a nuclear warhead capable of erasing cities in minutes. Humanity's greatest leap forward had also armed it with the means for instant extinction. Public reaction oscillated between pride and discomfort. When films and magazines celebrated NASA's achievements, the darker origins were politely omitted. Museums displayed V-2 engines beside Saturn mock-ups, labeling them precursors, as if lineage required no morality. Only in the 1980s did survivors' accounts begin to penetrate popular memory, revealing the human cost behind the machinery. The moral reckoning arrived late, and even then, unevenly. For every voice demanding acknowledgement, another argued that history should move on, that the dead had long since been overtaken by the living who benefited from their suffering. Inside NASA, the German generation aged. Von Braun retired in 1972 and died 5 years later, buried under an epitaph quoting Psalm 19, "The heavens declare the glory of God." It was a fitting irony. The man who had once served a godless regime resting beneath words of divine wonder. His funeral drew astronauts, generals, and ministers. Few spoke of Peenemünde. Yet among his colleagues, the awareness never vanished. When engineers described the roar of the Saturn engines, they still used the German term shove for thrust, a small linguistic ghost whispering that origins cannot be erased, only absorbed. The geopolitical consequences were equally profound. The technology harvested from Nazi Germany had propelled both superpowers into the atomic age. Every missile test, every orbiting satellite, every nuclear deterrent strategy traced back to that moment in 1945 when Allied soldiers found boxes of blueprints in the ruins. The knowledge extracted from a defeated regime became the scaffolding of global power. And while politicians spoke of freedom, the scientists knew the truth, that science itself is neutral, but its application is never innocent. As the decades passed, the dual legacy hardened into paradox. The same formulas that incinerated London had enabled humanity to touch the moon. The same minds once pledged to a dictator had extended the boundaries of civilization. History offered no verdict, only reflection. Progress had not absolved the past. It had merely carried it forward, translated into new languages, painted with new flags. And somewhere deep within the roar of a rocket launch, if one listened closely enough, one could still hear the echo of engines that once rose from the Baltic coast, fueled by desperation, ambition, and the unending human hunger to reach beyond the limits of the world below. On a humid July morning in 1969, the dream that had begun in secrecy beneath the forests of Peenemünde finally reached its ultimate destination. The Saturn V rocket stood at Cape Canaveral like a monument to both genius and contradiction. At 363 feet tall, it was the largest and most powerful machine ever built by human hands, an embodiment of mankind's will to transcend gravity. Yet for those who understood its ancestry, it was impossible to ignore the past etched into every component. When its engines ignited and the ground trembled beneath millions of pounds of thrust, a strange silence gripped the watching engineers. They knew the sound. It was the same thunder that once echoed across Europe, now reborn as applause. As Apollo 11 soared into the heavens, television screens around the world glowed with wonder. Children pointed skyward. Old soldiers wept. Presidents spoke of unity, destiny, and peace. And yet, among the quiet corners of history, a more somber truth lingered. The journey to the moon had begun in war, not peace, in the cold laboratories of a dictatorship obsessed with conquest. The same equations that carried Neil Armstrong to the lunar surface had been derived from experiments once conducted under the watch of the SS. The triumph of Apollo was undeniable. So too was its inheritance. When Neil Armstrong's boot pressed into lunar dust, humanity cheered as one. The words, "one giant leap for mankind," became immortal, carried across generations. But for a handful of aging engineers watching the broadcast from Huntsville, it was also a moment of reckoning. They had seen the dream fulfilled. It was built upon memories they could never fully escape. Some smiled through tears. Others turned away, unable to reconcile the beauty of the moment with the darkness of its origins. To them, the moon was not merely a destination. It was absolution sought but never granted. In the years that followed, NASA's glory expanded, space stations, shuttles, interplanetary probes, but so did historical awareness. Investigative journalists and declassified files began to peel back layers of myth. Documents from Operation Paperclip revealed the full extent of the government's efforts to hide Nazi affiliations. Scientists once described as civilian specialists were shown to have been active participants in the regime's war machine. Arthur Rudolph, one of von Braun's key collaborators, was eventually stripped of his U.S. citizenship after revelations about his role in using forced labor at the Middlework plant. The past, buried for decades beneath layers of triumphal narrative, began to reemerge, not to erase achievement, but to demand acknowledgement. Still, even with these revelations, the moral calculus remained agonizingly complex. Without the knowledge salvaged from Peenemünde, would humanity have reached space so soon? Would the Cold War balance of terror have prevented another world conflict, or would it have hastened one? History offered no definitive answers, only reminders that progress and peril often share the same trajectory. The rockets that once symbolized division now represented exploration. The minds that once served destruction had, in a strange twist of fate, helped unite the planet in wonder. But the question persisted. Does redemption through innovation erase complicity, or does it merely obscure it? By the dawn of the 1980s, the generation that had built both the V2 and the Saturn V was fading. Von Braun was gone, Korolev too. The Cold War still loomed, but their shared legacy remained, a fusion of rivalry and cooperation that had propelled mankind beyond its cradle. The same blueprints that once bore the stamp of the Reich now sat in museums beside American flags, labeled artifacts of history. School children gazed upon them without understanding the moral weight they carried. The world had chosen to remember the glory and forget the guilt. And yet, every time a rocket launches, every burst of fire that lifts humanity toward the stars, that lineage stirs quietly beneath the noise. The line between destruction and discovery is thinner than most care to admit. The steel, the equations, the design, they carry memory as surely as thrust. The men of Peenemünde, whatever their sins or dreams, had altered the course of civilization. Their blueprints had traveled from a dictator's command bunker to the launch pads of Cape Canaveral, from vengeance to vision, from darkness to the light of the moon. The war had ended. The Reich had fallen, but its knowledge had survived, reshaped, repurposed, rebranded, and in that survival lay the most haunting truth of all. History never truly dies. It only changes uniform. In the quiet after every launch, when the smoke clears and the roar fades into the ocean breeze, one can almost hear history exhale. The rockets standing at Cape Canaveral today are larger, cleaner, and infinitely more advanced. Yet in their design lies an invisible thread that stretches back through decades of ambition and ashes. What began as a weapon of despair became a vessel of hope, and that transformation is both humanity's greatest redemption and its most sobering lesson. The story of Peenemünde and Cape Canaveral is not simply a tale of technology. It is the story of human nature itself, brilliant, conflicted, and forever reaching beyond its own shadow. For all the triumphs of science, the past remains woven into every triumph's foundation. Progress, by its nature, consumes what came before it, sometimes noble, sometimes terrible. The men who once stood under the banners of tyranny later watched the same machines lift symbols of freedom into the stars. Yet morality does not vanish in smoke. It lingers in the silence between applause and memory. It asks us whether greatness achieved through guilt can still be called pure. Standing today on the same stretch of Florida coast, one sees monuments of exploration, the vehicle assembly building, the Apollo memorials, the glimmering towers of modern rocketry. Children visit, dreaming of Mars. Few realize that beneath their feet lie the echoes of another time, when the sky was not a destination, but a battlefield. And perhaps that is the essence of history's evolution, its ability to transform horror into inspiration, not by forgetting, but by enduring. The blueprints of Peenemünde were not destroyed, they were rewritten. Their lines became the architecture of the modern world: satellites, spaceflight, communication, defense. They carried both the burden of their birth and the brilliance of their potential. In them lies the paradox of mankind, that from darkness can emerge light, and from destruction, discovery. The engines that once screamed through the night over Europe now thunder peacefully toward the stars. And in their echoes, one truth remains: history never ends. It ascends, one launch at a time, carrying both our sins and our dreams into the endless sky.